What does a man who has everything truly fear? Is it the loss of his empire, built on whispers and shadows? Is it the long arm of the law, forever reaching but never quite grasping? Or is it something far more intimate, far more terrifying? The chilling realization that the very hands he has shaken, the faces he has smiled upon, the family he has sworn to protect, are the same ones sharpening the blade in the darkness. Tonight, we pull back the velvet curtain on a world of opulent deception. We invite you to a banquet where loyalty is the rarest dish on the menu. This is the final meal of a king, a feast held in the shadow of the gallows. Welcome to the last supper of a crime lord, Betrayal at Midnight. Before we take our seat at the table, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss a single moment of the treachery that awaits. The rain fell on the city like a shroud. From the penthouse of the Olympian Tower, the sprawling metropolis below was a glittering tapestry of fractured light, a kingdom of 1,000,000 souls, each blissfully unaware that their sovereign watched them from his throne in the clouds. Don Alessandro Volkov, known in the hushed tones of the underworld as the Lion, stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study. At 65, his mane of silver hair was still thick, his shoulders broad within the tailored confines of a silk smoking jacket, and his eyes, the color of storm clouds, still held the predatory glint that had carved him an empire from the concrete and steel below. He held a crystal tumbler half-filled with amber Lakita vintage scotch that cost more than the monthly rent of the apartments he could see from his perch. The ice clinked softly, a lonely sound in the cavernous, silent room. Silence. It had become his most constant companion and his most dreaded enemy. In his youth, there had always been noise. The roar of engines, the staccato of gunfire, the boisterous laughter of men drunk on power and wine, the desperate pleas of his enemies. Now the silence was a canvas, and on it, his own mind painted murals of paranoia. Tonight was the night of the Cena Ultima, the Last Supper. It was a tradition he had started a decade ago, a theatrical, almost blasphemous affair held every year on this exact date. It was the anniversary of the night he had consolidated his power, the night his predecessor, Rico the Rat Falzone, had choked on his own ambition and a strategically placed garrote wire during a late-night dinner. Alessandro had inherited Falzone's chair, his operations, and his penchant for symbolic gatherings. The purpose of the dinner was twofold. It was a celebration of his reign and a test of fealty. He would gather his most trusted lieutenants, his inner circle, his family, and they would break bread. He would watch them, listen to their toasts, look into their eyes, and try to discern the truth from the performance. In their world, every man was an actor, and the stage was perpetually set for tragedy. This year, however, the performance felt different. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, a static charge that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. Betrayal wasn't a possibility. It was an inevitability. It was the final, bloody stanza in the opera of every man like him. The only question was when the music would stop. A soft chime echoed through the penthouse. The first guest had arrived. Alessandro didn't turn. He knew who it would be. Punctuality was a virtue few in his organization possessed, but his brother was a man of the cloth, and for him, punctuality was a doctrine. He took a slow sip of his scotch, letting the peaty smoke curl on his tongue before he turned to face the door. Father Michael Volkov stood in the archway, a stark silhouette of black against the warm, ambient light of the grand hallway. He was younger than Alessandro by 5 years, thinner, with the same sharp cheekbones but none of the brutal certainty in his eyes. His gaze was perpetually troubled, a battlefield of faith and familial duty. He clutched a small, leather-bound Bible in one hand, a shield against a world he had been born into but had desperately tried to escape. "Misha," Alessandro rumbled, his voice a low gravel. He used the childhood name, a small, deliberate twist of the knife to remind his brother of a time before collars, both clerical and criminal. "Sandro," Michael replied, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "You are tempting the heavens again with this spectacle." Alessandro chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. The heavens had their chance to smite me long ago, little brother. They seemed to enjoy the show. Come, have a drink. The Lord knows you could use one. He gestured towards the magnificent mahogany bar that dominated one side of the study. It was stocked with bottles that were less beverages and more liquid history, artifacts of forgotten distilleries and legendary vintages. I will have water, Michael said, stepping into the room. He moved with a hesitant grace, as if afraid the plush Persian rug might burst into flames beneath his feet. I must keep a clear head. A clear head is a curse in a world of pleasant lies, Alessandro countered, pouring himself another 2 fingers of scotch. It forces you to see the ugliness. Tell me, Misha, what does your clear head see tonight? The priest looked at his brother, his expression a mixture of pity and fear. I see a man who has built his castle on a cliff's edge, and the tide is coming in. You've grown. Distant, Sandro. Wary. More so than usual. Wary is what has kept me alive, Alessandro said, his eyes narrowing slightly. It is what keeps this roof over your head, what paid for your seminary, what allows you to preach forgiveness while your brother deals in sin. Do not forget that. The words hung between them, sharp and cold. Michael flinched but didn't look away. I have never forgotten. It is the cross I bear. I pray for your soul every night. Pray for my enemies. It will be more productive, Alessandro said, turning back to the window. Their numbers seem to be growing. The chime sounded again, louder this time, followed by the faint murmur of voices from the foyer. Alessandro's body tensed. The actors were assembling. The next to enter was not one person, but 2, a pairing of power and beauty that commanded the room's attention. Marco Bellini, known as the Viper, was Alessandro's underboss, his heir apparent. He was 35, handsome in a cruel, sharp-edged way, with black hair slicked back from his forehead and eyes that were always calculating, always assessing. He moved with the fluid confidence of a predator who knows he is at the top of the food chain. He was everything Alessandro had been in his prime. Ambitious, ruthless, and utterly charming when the situation called for it. He wore a tailored suit of charcoal gray that seemed to have been spun from shadow and smoke. On his arm, a vision in emerald green, was Isabella Volkov, Alessandro's wife. She was 30 years his junior, a former art gallery curator he had met and subsequently acquired 3 years ago. Her beauty was of the classical, heartbreaking variety: high cheekbones, a cascade of dark auburn hair, and eyes the color of old jade. She was his trophy, the ultimate symbol of his power, a vibrant flower flourishing in a garden of death. But Isabella was no wilting petal. There was a fierce intelligence in her gaze, a coiled strength in her posture that suggested she was far more than mere decoration. She surveyed the room, her eyes lingering for a fraction of a second too long on Michael before settling on her husband. "My love," she said, her voice a smooth melody. She detached herself from Marco's arm and glided across the room to kiss Alessandro on the cheek. Her perfume, a heady mix of jasmine and something wilder, enveloped him. "You look troubled." "Merely contemplative," Alessandro replied, his hand resting on the small of her back. The gesture was possessive, a brand. "Marco, you're looking well. Business is good." Marco smiled, a flash of perfectly white teeth. "Business is always good, Don Volkov. The city is prosperous. Investments are flourishing." He dipped his head in a gesture of respect that was just a little too polished, a little too perfect. "Father Michael, a pleasure to see you." Michael merely nodded, his grip tightening on his Bible. He and Marco were oil and water, spirit and sin. The animosity between them was a palpable thing, a cold spot in the warm room. The final guest arrived without the courtesy of the chime. Luca Santoro, the ghost, did not arrive, he simply appeared. He was Alessandro's head of security, his shadow, a man who had been by his side for 20 years. He was of indeterminate age, with a face of granite that betrayed no emotion and eyes that saw everything. He was dressed, as always, in a simple, perfectly fitted black suit. He was not a guest at the supper, but he was as much a part of it as the wine and the bread. He was the sentinel, the final arbiter of any dispute. His presence was a comfort and a constant reminder of the violence that underpinned their entire existence. He gave Alessandro a short, almost imperceptible nod, and then melted back into the shadows near the doorway. His presence so subtle that one could easily forget he was there. But no one ever did. "Now that the family is all here," Alessandro said, his voice taking on a formal, almost ceremonial tone, "let us proceed to the dining room. The chef has prepared a memorable feast." The dining room was a testament to Alessandro's ego. A long, single slab of polished obsidian served as the table, reflecting the magnificent crystal chandelier that hung above it like a constellation of captured stars. The walls were adorned with original works of arte Caravaggio here, a D'Olimpica there, each one a masterpiece of light and shadow, beauty and violence. The table was set for 5, with ornate silverware and crystal goblets that sparkled menacingly. They took their seats, Alessandro naturally at the head of the table. To his right, Isabella, a splash of vibrant life against the somber black. To his left, Marco, his coiled energy barely contained. At the far end, facing his brother down the long, reflective expanse of the table, sat Father Michael, looking small and out of place, a dove in a viper's nest. Servants, silent and efficient, moved with ghostly quiet, filling water glasses and laying out the first course, a delicate oyster soup with saffron and pearls of caviar. For a long while, the only sounds were the clinking of spoons against porcelain and the incessant drumming of the rain against the panoramic windows. Alessandro watched them over the rim of his soup bowl. He watched the way Marco's eyes darted towards Isabella when he thought no one was looking. He saw the flicker of something. Was it contempt? Pity? In Isabella's gaze as she glanced at her husband. He saw the profound, soul-deep weariness in his brother's face, the face of a man forced to dine with devils. "It is good to be together," Alessandro began, his voice echoing slightly in the grand room. "In times of uncertainty, family is the only true anchor." He raised his wine glass, a deep, blood-red Barolo. "To family, to family," they all echoed, the words sounding hollow, rehearsed. "Marco," Alessandro continued, setting his glass down, "tell me about the port situation. I hear whispers, rumors of a new player trying to move in on our territory. The Triads, perhaps." Marco carefully dabbed his lips with a linen napkin before answering. His movements were always precise, economical. "Whispers, Don Volkov. Nothing more. The port is secure. Our friends at the Union are loyal. The Triads know their place." His smile was reassuring, but his eyes were flat, unreadable. "You have nothing to worry about." "Worry is the price of the crown, my boy," Alessandro said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "It is my job to worry. It is your job to ensure my worries are unfounded." The implicit threat was clear. "Do not fail me." "Your worries are unfounded," Marco repeated, his voice smooth as silk. Alessandro shifted his gaze to his wife. "Isabella, my dear, you have been quiet tonight. Did you enjoy the ballet last evening?" Isabella, who had been tracing the rim of her water goblet with a slender finger, looked up. Her jade eyes met his. "It was divine, Sandro. A story of love and betrayal. The Black Swan was exquisite. So tragic. She gives everything for a love that was never real. A prince who was a phantom." Her words were a subtle poison dart, aimed directly at him. He was her prince, her phantom, the one who had given her a gilded cage but not the freedom she craved. Alessandro felt a familiar sting of anger, quickly suppressed. He had bought her, and she had never let him forget it. "Art should be tragic," he said, taking a slow sip of wine. "It reminds us of the stakes. Without tragedy, there is no beauty." "Or perhaps," Michael interjected, his voice surprisingly firm, "it reminds us of the consequences of our choices, of pride. The Bible is filled with such tragedies. Kings who lose their kingdoms because of hubris." The room fell silent again. The priest had drawn a line in the sand. Marco smirked, enjoying the open challenge to the Don's authority from the one man who could possibly get away with it. Isabella watched Alessandro, her expression a mask of detached curiosity. Alessandro stared at his brother down the length of the table. The reflection of the chandelier danced between them like a river of diamonds. For a moment, the civilized veneer of the evening threatened to crack. The air crackled with decades of resentment, of love and hate intertwined so tightly they were indistinguishable. The Bible also speaks of forgiveness, little brother, Alessandro said, his voice dangerously soft. But forgiveness is a currency for the next world. In this one we deal in loyalty. And loyalty, he paused, his gaze sweeping over each of them in turn, is paid in blood. The servants appeared again, clearing away the soup bowls and replacing them with the next course. Seared foie gras with a fig reduction. The rich, decadent aroma filled the room, a stark contrast to the chilling atmosphere. Alessandro leaned back in his chair, a king surveying his court. The first act of the play was over. He had set the stage, baited the traps. He could feel the threads of conspiracy in the air, could almost see them weaving between his guests. The viper, his ambitious underboss, hungry for the throne. The saint, his tormented brother, who hated the sins but enjoyed their fruits. The queen, his beautiful, enigmatic wife, whose heart was a locked room to which he had never found the key. And in the shadows, the ghost watched, his loyalty an unspoken, absolute thing. Or was it? In a world built on lies, the most dangerous lie is the one you tell yourself. Alessandro had told himself for 20 years that Luca was his to command, a tool, an extension of his will. But every man has a will of his own. He picked up his fork. The rain lashed against the windows, a furious, percussive beat counting down the hours. The clock on the grand mantelpiece, a gilded monstrosity of marble and gold, showed the time. It was 10 o'clock, 2 hours until midnight. 2 hours until the betrayal he knew was coming. He felt a strange sense of calm settle over him, the calm of a man who has accepted his fate. He had lived his life as a predator, and it was only fitting that his end would come in a den of his own making, surrounded by the very beasts he had sired. The only question that remained was which one would strike first. He took a bite of the foie gras. It was rich, impossibly smooth, and it tasted of ashes. The conversation flowed like the expensive wine being poured into their glasses, smooth on the surface, with a bitter, complex undertone. As the main course was served, a whole roasted lamb seasoned with rosemary and garlic, its skin a perfect, crispy brown. The facade of familial warmth was painstakingly maintained. The talk was of trivialities: the fluctuating stock market, a new art exhibit downtown, the upcoming mayoral election. Each topic was a carefully chosen stepping stone across a river of unspoken truths. Alessandro played the part of the magnanimous patriarch, guiding the conversation, asking probing questions disguised as idle curiosity. He felt like a bomb disposal expert, delicately snipping at wires, trying to find the one connected to the detonator. "Isabella, my jewel," he said, gesturing with his wine glass towards her. "Your charity auction for the children's hospital was a great success, I hear. You have a gift for charming money from the pockets of old men." Isabella offered a polite, thin-lipped smile. "They are generous because the cause is worthy. And perhaps," she added, her eyes glinting in the candlelight, "they see it as a way to cleanse their sullied consciences, a down payment on a clear passage to the afterlife." The jab was aimed not at the anonymous donors but squarely at him. He was the king of sullied consciences. Marco let out a low chuckle, covering it with a cough when he saw Alessandro's gaze darken. "An admirable sentiment," Marco said, jumping in to diffuse the tension. "It is good that the Volkov name is associated with such noble endeavors. It softens our public image." "Image?" Alessandro scoffed, carving a thick slice of lamb. "Image is for politicians and actors. We deal in reality. And our reality is that power, not philanthropy, is what keeps this family safe." He placed the slice of meat onto Isabella's plate, a gesture that was both caring and controlling. "Eat, my dear. You are too thin." "She has the grace of a swan," Michael murmured, almost to himself, his eyes on Isabella. The comment was innocent, yet in the context of Isabella's earlier mention of the ballet, it felt loaded. It was a moment of unguarded admiration, perhaps something more. Alessandro's head snapped towards his brother. "What did you say, Misha?" Michael's face flushed. He had been drinking steadily, the wine loosening the tongue he usually kept so firmly in check. "Nothing, Sandro. Merely an observation. She is a graceful woman." "Indeed, she is," Alessandro said slowly, his eyes boring into Michael's. He saw the flicker of fear in his brother's gaze, but also a flicker of something else, defiance. It was new. For years, Michael had been a creature of guilt and quiet disapproval. This newfound courage was unsettling. Where did it come from? He decided to change tack to turn the pressure onto his heir apparent. "Marco, young Rico Falzone has been released from prison. I hear he is back in the city." The name Falzone hung in the air like poison gas. Rico Falzone was the son of the man Alessandro had killed to take power. The younger Rico had been a hot-headed teenager then, swearing vengeance before being sent away on a trumped-up drug charge. Now he was a man in his 30s, hardened by a decade behind bars. Marco's calm demeanor didn't slip, but Alessandro saw the subtle tightening of the muscles in his jaw. He is a nobody, a ghost. His father's name carries no weight anymore. The old guard is dead or loyal to us. Ghosts have a way of haunting people, Alessandro mused. They whisper in the ears of the discontented. They remind them of old loyalties. Are you certain all of the old guard are as loyal as they profess to be? I am certain, Marco said, his voice firm. I have made sure of it. Anyone with a nostalgic streak has been persuaded to see the benefits of the current administration. The euphemism was not lost on anyone at the table. Persuaded was Marco's specialty. He was a master of a quiet, brutal efficiency that left no loose ends. Good, Alessandro nodded, though he was not convinced. He knew Marco was ambitious. What better way for an ambitious man to seize power than by allying himself with the son of the former king? Anoint the ghost, give him a face, and use his thirst for revenge as a weapon. It was a classic move, one he himself might have made in his youth. He filed the thought away. He then turned his attention to the most difficult piece of the puzzle, his wife. Her motives were always opaque, her desires hidden behind a veil of cool civility. Isabella, he said, his voice softening, I have not forgotten your birthday next week. I have acquired the D'Olimpica you so admired at the auction. The green turban. It will be delivered tomorrow. It was a magnificent gesture, a painting worth millions. It was also a gilded chain, another beautiful object to adorn her cage. For the first time that evening, a genuine emotion flickered across her face. Surprise, quickly followed by a carefully constructed mask of gratitude. Sandro, that is incredibly generous. Thank you. Nothing is too good for my wife, he said, reaching across the table to place his hand over hers. Her skin was cold. It is a portrait of a woman of great strength and mystery. It reminds me of you. A woman trapped in a frame, she replied, her voice soft, but the words were like shards of glass. She gently withdrew her hand from under his, but beautiful nonetheless. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed the half-hour. 10:30. The meal continued. Course after course arrived and was cleared away. A palate-cleansing lemon sorbet, followed by aged cheeses, exotic fruits, and finally, a rich tiramisu. With each course, more wine was poured, and the carefully constructed walls of decorum began to crumble, brick by brick. Michael, now thoroughly inebriated, began to speak of damnation and redemption, his words slurring slightly. We are all of us, scribbling in God's ledger, he declared, pointing a wavering finger at Marco. And your page, Signor Bellini, must be black with ink. Do you ever think of the reckoning? The final judgment? Marco regarded the priest with an amused, contemptuous smile. I believe in making my own judgments, Father, and my own heaven here on earth. I leave the fairy tales to you. It is not a fairy tale. Michael slammed his fist on the table, rattling the silverware. Hell is real, Marco, and it is filled with men like you. Men like. He stopped, his gaze shifting to his brother at the head of the table. He couldn't say it. He couldn't condemn his own blood, the man who was both his cross and his savior. Men like me, Alessandro finished for him, his voice dangerously calm. Men who are not afraid to get their hands dirty to protect what is theirs. To protect you, Misha. He leaned forward. You eat the food from my table, you drink my wine, you live under the protection of my name, all while you judge me from your pedestal of piety. There is a word for that, little brother. Hypocrisy. Tears welled in Michael's eyes. I pray for you, Sandro. Every day, I pray that you will turn from this path. Your prayers are wasted, Alessandro said coldly. Pray for yourself. He pushed his chair back and rose, walking slowly over to the windows. The storm outside had intensified, the rain hammering against the glass like angry fists. Below, the city lights blurred and swam, a river of gold and neon. He felt a profound sense of isolation, of being utterly alone in a room full of people who were supposed to be his closest confidants. He thought back, his mind drifting to the past, searching for the moment the first crack had appeared in the foundation of his empire. Was it when he had married Isabella, bringing this beautiful, unknowable stranger into the heart of his family? Her intelligence was a threat. He knew she saw their world not with the conditioned acceptance of those born into it, but with the clear, critical eye of an outsider. She saw the ugliness, the brutality, and the weakness. Or was it when he had first noticed the hunger in Marco's eyes? He had groomed the boy, taught him everything he knew. He had seen him as a son, the successor who would carry on his legacy. But he had created a predator too much like himself. He had taught the viper to bite, and now he was surprised that it might turn on its master. It was the height of arrogance. And Michael, his brother, had always been his conscience, the one pure thing in his life. But that purity had curdled into resentment. Michael didn't just hate the sin. Alessandro now realized he hated the sinner. He hated being indebted to a monster. And a man consumed by righteous hatred could be just as dangerous as a man consumed by greed. His eyes scanned the room, reflected in the dark glass of the window. He saw the scene as if it were a painting. The long, dark table, the remnants of a decadent feast, and the three figures seated there. The viper watching him with calculating patience. The queen, her face a mask of serene indifference. The saint, slumped in his chair, weeping silently into his wine. It was a tableau of betrayal, a living, breathing work of art. And where was the ghost in this painting? Alessandro's eyes found Luca's reflection. The security chief stood by the door, perfectly still, his presence as solid and unyielding as the marble pillars around him. Luca was the constant, the one piece that had never changed. For 20 years, he had been Alessandro's right hand, the silent instrument of his will. He had saved Alessandro's life on 3 separate occasions. His loyalty was legendary, absolute. But what is loyalty? The question echoed in the silent chambers of Alessandro's mind. Is it loyalty to a man, or is it loyalty to the power he represents? If the man becomes weak, a liability, does true loyalty then mean removing him for the good of the organization? It was a cold, brutal calculus, the kind of logic he himself had used to justify his own bloody ascent. Was Luca capable of such logic? Alessandro had always seen him as a weapon, but he had forgotten that every weapon must be wielded by a hand, guided by a mind. He turned from the window, a decision solidifying within him. He would force the issue. He would tear down the curtain of polite fiction and let the ugly truth onto the stage. The time for games is over, he announced, his voice cutting through the tense silence. Everyone looked up, startled. There is a traitor at this table. The accusation landed with the force of a physical blow. Marco stiffened, his hand instinctively dropping below the table. Isabella's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine fear in them for the first time. Michael looked up, his tear-streaked face a mess of confusion and dread. Don Volkov, Marco began, his voice a low growl. That is a serious allegation. I do not make allegations, Alessandro said, walking slowly back towards the table. He moved with the deliberate, heavy grace of a lion circling its prey. I state facts. One of you has been conspiring with Rico Falzone. One of you plans to see me dead before the sun rises. He stopped behind Isabella's chair, placing his hands on her shoulders. She flinched at his touch. Is it you, my love? Are you tired of your gilded cage? Did you trade your husband's life for a promise of freedom from a boy with a grudge? Isabella turned her head, looking up at him, her jade eyes flashing with defiance. I am your wife, Sandro. In our world, that is a life sentence. There is no freedom. To conspire would be suicide, and I am not suicidal. Her denial was powerful, convincing. He moved on, standing behind Marco. Or is it you, my ambitious protege? The heir who has grown tired of waiting for the king to die of natural causes. Did you offer Falzone's ghost his revenge in exchange for his father's loyalists? Clever plan. A plan I would have applauded, were it not aimed at my own heart. Marco slowly raised his hands, showing they were empty. He met Alessandro's gaze without flinching. I am your man, Don Volkov. I have always been your man. My only ambition is to serve you. When you are gone, I will be ready to lead. But I would never hasten your departure. That is not my way. The lie was as smooth and polished as the obsidian table. Finally, Alessandro turned his gaze to his brother at the far end of the table. And you, Misha, the man of God, does your hatred for my sins finally outweigh your love for your brother? Did you decide that my death would be a form of divine justice? A cleansing of the family name? Perhaps you offered Falzone absolution in exchange for my damnation. Michael stared at him, his face ashen, his mouth opening and closing with no sound. The accusation was so monstrous, so far beyond his comprehension, that he could not even form a denial. He simply shook his head, a broken, pathetic gesture. Alessandro let the silence stretch, the tension building until it was almost unbearable. He had shaken the tree. Now he would wait to see what fell out. He returned to his seat at the head of the table. The clock began to chime. 11 o'clock. 1 hour to go. One of you is lying, Alessandro said softly, his eyes scanning each of their faces. And the truth has a way of coming out at midnight. We will sit here and we will wait. And before the final bell tolls, the traitor will reveal themselves. He picked up his wine glass. To the truth, he toasted, his voice laced with venom. No one moved. No one spoke. They were trapped, caught in the old lion's final, desperate gambit. The feast was over. The judgment had begun. Outside, the storm raged, and inside the silent, opulent dining room, for people waited for the stroke of midnight, each of them knowing that by the time the clock finished chiming, at least one of them would be dead. The final hour was an eternity of silence. The servants had been dismissed. The remnants of the tiramisu and cheese plates sat on the table, a grotesque still life of a feast that had turned into a wake. The only sounds were the howling of the wind, the relentless drumming of rain, and the loud, rhythmic tick-tock of the gilded clock on the mantel. Each tick was a hammer blow, driving the nail deeper into the coffin of the evening. Alessandro sat enthroned at the head of the table, his face a mask of iron control. He barely moved, his storm cloud eyes shifting from Marco to Isabella to Michael, dissecting them with his gaze, searching for the tell, the crack in the facade. He was a hunter in the final moments of the stalk, every sense heightened, his body thrumming with a mixture of dread and exhilaration. This was the ultimate game, and he had lived his entire life to play it. Marco affected an air of bored indignation. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the dregs of the Barolo in his glass, occasionally glancing at his platinum watch. His calmness was his armor, a declaration of his innocence. But Alessandro saw the fine sheen of sweat on his brow, the subtle, rhythmic tapping of his finger against the stem of his glass. It was the restlessness of a man whose carefully laid plans were threatening to unravel. Isabella was a statue carved from ice. Her hands were folded in her lap, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. She stared at a point in the middle of the table, seemingly lost in her own world. But her stillness was not serene. It was the stillness of a compressed spring, of immense energy held in check. She was waiting. But for what? Michael was a wreck. He sat slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, muttering fragments of prayers under his breath. The alcohol had worn off, leaving behind a raw, visceral fear. He was a man of faith trapped in a godless crucible, a lamb awaiting the slaughter, uncertain of from which direction the wolf would pounce. And in the corner, by the door, stood Luca, the ghost, unmoving, unspeaking, his presence a dark, silent promise of violence. His gaze was fixed on Alessandro, a loyal hound awaiting his master's command. Or so it seemed. The minute hand on the clock crept upwards with agonizing slowness. 10 minutes to midnight. 5, 3. At 2 minutes to the hour, Alessandro spoke, his voice quiet yet carrying the weight of finality. The time for confession is almost over. Marco looked up, a sneer on his handsome face. This is absurd. You have no proof. Only paranoia, old man. The insult, old man, was a calculated risk, a final piece of defiance. Alessandro's eyes narrowed, but he did not rise to the bait. Proof is for courts, Marco. I am not a judge. I am an executioner. My proof is the certainty in my own gut, which has kept me alive for 65 years, while men like you have ended up as footnotes in police reports. The clock began to whir, the internal mechanics gathering themselves for the momentous task of striking the hour. It was a sound that filled the room, a sound of inexorable fate. As the first deep, resonant chime of midnight rang out, a blur of motion broke the tableau. It was Marco. As Alessandro had predicted, the viper struck first. He moved with blinding speed, his hand reappearing from under the table, not with a gun, but with a small, sleek remote detonator. His thumb hovered over the red button. It's over, Alessandro, Marco hissed, a triumphant, feral grin spreading across his face. This entire penthouse is wired. Enough C4 to send this whole floor to the street in a million pieces. You accused me of conspiring with a ghost? No, my ambition is my own. I don't share power. Alessandro looked at the detonator, then at Marco's face, and he felt a cold wave of disappointment. It was so crude, so predictable. A simple bomb threat. And what is your plan, boy? Alessandro asked, his voice laced with contempt. You blow us all to hell? Yourself included? A bold, if rather short-sighted, path to the throne. Don't play me for a fool, Marco spat. The charges are placed only under your half of the building. And this, he held up the detonator, has a dead man's switch. If my heart stops, we all go. But I have no intention of dying. Luca. At the sound of his name, Luca moved, but not towards Alessandro. He took 2 quick, silent steps and stood behind Marco's chair. Marco's grin widened. You see? The ghost was never yours. Loyalty is to the future, not the past. Luca understands this. Now, you will have your man escort you to your study. You will make a phone call to your capos. Tell them you are retiring, effective immediately. You are naming me as your successor. Then you will take that ridiculous letter opener from your desk, the one shaped like a Roman dagger, and you will end your own life. Your reign will be over. My reign will begin. Cleanly. No mess. Just a tragic suicide. It was a good plan. Ambitious, ruthless, and it left Marco with the entire organization intact. Alessandro had to give him that. He looked at Luca, standing behind his protégé, his face as impassive as ever. He felt the first true pang of betrayal. Not from Marco, the snake he had always known would bite, but from Luca, his shadow, his ghost. 20 years of unwavering loyalty, all of it a lie. Luca? Alessandro said, his voice heavy with a sorrow that surprised even himself. After all these years. Him. Luca did not answer. He simply looked at his master, his eyes two dark, empty pits. The clock continued to chime. The fourth bell. The fifth. And then, something unexpected happened. Isabella laughed. It was not a hysterical laugh, but a low, melodious sound, filled with genuine amusement. All eyes turned to her. She slowly rose from her chair, the emerald green of her dress a slash of color in the monochrome drama. "Oh, Marco," she said, shaking her head as if scolding a foolish child. "You really are a blunt instrument. So much noise, so much testosterone. Did you really think it was all about you?" Marco stared at her, his triumphant expression faltering, replaced by confusion. "What are you talking about, woman? Sit down." "Don't talk to her that way," a voice said. It was quiet but firm. Came from Father Michael. He was on his feet now, his fear replaced by a strange, resolute calm. He moved to stand beside Isabella, his hand resting protectively on her arm. Marco's confusion turned to rage. "You? The sniveling priest? What is this?" "This?" Isabella said, her voice turning as cold and sharp as ice, "is the real plan." The seventh chime rang out. Luca's hand, which had been resting on the back of Marco's chair, suddenly shot down. It was not a gun he produced, but a thin, almost invisible garrote wire with two wooden handles. In one fluid, practiced motion, he looped it around Marco's neck and pulled taut. Marco's eyes bulged in shock and terror. He dropped the detonator, his hands flying to his throat, clawing at the wire that was biting deep into his flesh. A choked, gurgling sound was his only response. His face turned a deep, ugly purple. He kicked his legs under the table, the desperate, frantic death throes of an animal caught in a trap. Alessandro watched, stunned into silence. The viper was being defanged, not by him, but by the two people he had least suspected. The eighth chime. The ninth. Marco's struggles weakened. His body went limp, and Luca let him slump forward onto the table, his head landing with a dull thud amongst the dessert plates. The triumphant underboss was dead. The room was silent save for the tolling of the clock. 10th. 11th. Isabella calmly walked over to where the detonator had fallen. She picked it up, examined it for a moment, and then looked at Alessandro. "There is no bomb, Sandro," she said coolly. "It's a garage door opener." Marco was always more style than substance. He thought Luca was his, but Luca's loyalty was never to the man on the throne. It was to the family. And you were destroying it with your paranoia and your ego. The final 12th chime echoed through the penthouse, a death knell for one era and the birth of another. Alessandro stared at his wife, at his brother who stood by her side, a loyal soldier, and at Luca, his ghost, who now served another master. Or had he always? "You!" he breathed, the realization dawning on him. "All of you. This was your conspiracy." "Not conspiracy," Michael corrected, his voice filled with a newfound strength. "A succession. A necessary transition. Your time was over, Sandro. You were becoming a liability, suspecting everyone, trusting no one. You would have torn us all apart in your madness. We did this to save the family, to save ourselves from you." "Enrico Falzone?" Alessandro asked, his mind racing to put the pieces together. "My idea," Isabella said, moving to the head of the table, not to his side, but to stand opposite him, an equal. "I leaked the rumor of a conspiracy with Falzone myself. I knew your paranoia would do the rest. I knew you would call this dinner. I knew you would accuse everyone, force Marco's hand. He was too predictable. And I knew he thought he had turned Luca. But Luca came to me months ago. He saw what you were becoming." Alessandro looked at Luca, the ghost who had finally spoken without words. Luca met his gaze and gave a single, slow nod. It was confirmation, judgment. "So what now?" Alessandro asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. His empire, his life's work, had been dismantled before his very eyes in a matter of minutes. Not by an army of enemies, but by his wife, his brother, and his most trusted man. It was a betrayal so perfect, so complete, that it was almost beautiful. Now, Isabella said, you will do exactly what Marco planned for you to do. You will call your capos. You will announce your retirement. But you will not name a successor. The family will be run by a council. By us. A new way. Quieter. More. Civilized. And if I refuse? Alessandro growled. A final flicker of the old lion's fire. Luca took a step forward from the shadows. The threat was unspoken but absolute. Alessandro looked at the faces of his betrayers. Isabella, his queen, now the true ruler. Michael, his saint, his moral compass, now a pragmatist stained by sin. Luca, his ghost, now the silent enforcer of a new regime. He had been outplayed, outmaneuvered at every turn. He was a king in checkmate. He slowly nodded, the fight draining out of him, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness. You will not kill me, he stated. It wasn't a question. No, Isabella confirmed. We will not. Your legend is still useful. You will live out your days here, in this penthouse. A comfortable retirement. A king in a gilded cage. A fitting end, don't you think? He was being given the same fate he had forced upon her. The irony was as bitter as bile. Alessandro Volkov, the lion, sank back into his chair. He looked at the dead body of his underboss, the man who thought he was the future. He looked at the new powers in the room, his own family, who had orchestrated his downfall with the precision of a master composer. The Last Supper was over. He had come expecting to unmask a traitor and had instead found himself the sole victim of a coup. The rain had finally stopped. Through the vast windows, the first hints of dawn were beginning to break over the city. The gray light of a new day. A new era. His era was over. He reached for the bottle of scotch on a nearby serving cart and poured himself a glass. The bottle was almost empty.